on behalf of Northern Arizona Peer and Family Coalition and NAMI Yavapai, I just want to welcome everybody. We're so glad you're here today. And we have a special guest presenter, and I will let Kathy introduce her.
Okay, so first of all, this is on the ins and outs of police mental health crisis response. And our main speaker, our only speaker, is Amanda Stamps. But before I go into her extensive biography or bio or whatever, I would just like to share that I've known Amanda, I guess, for about 10 years. She has really, really opened my eyes to how people, officers that are policemen or policewomen, are truly human beings and care. And I'll never forget the first time we met. I'm sitting at a table and all of a sudden this very rough looking group of women come in, and I can see guns protruding from their hips, and they swagger in and they surround me. They surround me in my table and sit behind me, and I freak. And this has been the source of discussion for a number of years between Amanda and I because of the stereotypes and the stigma, and she's had her own stigmas. And, you know, we've kind of worked through little things, but it has really, really enhanced my determination that we as a community support the police and really know what they're going through. So Amanda Stamps is vice president of their Arizona Crisis Intervention Team Association. She's also a retired Mesa Police Department officer. Amanda Stamps recently retired from the Mesa Police Department after more than 23 years. And I will say that she has become about 10 years younger since her retirement. During her career, she has worked as a patrol officer, a field trainings officer, a detective with the Special Victims Unit, and community engagement and youth development as a member of the peer support team, and most recently as the department's crisis intervention team coordinator, program coordinator. As a recognized subject matter expert, Detective Stamps teaches mental illness and crisis intervention to all officers, both at the academy level and in the continuing training, and provides training to communication and detention personnel. In 2015, Detective Stamps became the first full-time IT program coordinator for the Mesa Police Department and was involved in the creation of the crisis response team and current co-responder model. Detective Stamps has been a CIT officer since 2004 and has a BA in psychology from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, a MED in counseling and human relations from NAU, and is attending ASU and the College of Health Solutions in pursuit of a doctorate of behavioral health. Detective Stamps is a member of NAMI and CIT International and on the board of Mental Health America and on so many community advisory boards, and she is on many of them. Detective Stamps remains with the Mesa Police Department as a reserve officer. So welcome, Amanda, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Well, I really appreciate everybody who is here. I have found that in order to facilitate these discussions in a timely manner, and because I just have to, there's a few disclaimers for what we're going to talk about. I personally do not represent a law enforcement agency. I am here as the Arizona CIT Association Vice President. What we're going to talk about is law enforcement in general. Every agency has their own policies, procedures. If you have had experience with law enforcement agencies, it can look a lot different. What I will say is that I have trained across the state of Arizona. So I'm pretty familiar with what rural areas are doing. I've been up in Yuma, Flagstaff, most recently in Payson. So we can kind of generalize to it, but just understand that every city and county kind of has their own procedures. All of these situations and everything we're going to talk about involves people, whether it be the people on the call or the law enforcement officers. So everything is fluid. Things can look different. People do what people do. So nothing that we talk about is going to be a perfect answer that always fits all the time. And while I am super happy to discuss any kind of incidents you personally had with law enforcement, just keep in mind that when I wasn't there, so it's really going to be hard for me to give you any kind of solid answers about it, but we can talk about it in general ways. I do acknowledge that not everybody has positive interactions with law enforcement. Heck, I don't always have positive interactions with law enforcement. I work with them every single day, and I don't like all of them either. So I am a very big of a realist when I talk about officers. You know, if you just look in the state of Arizona, there's 15,000 of us. So there's a lot of people involved in these situations. So nothing you're going to say is going to hurt my feelings. You can ask any questions you want. I'm very super open to it. I will tell you that when I was making this presentation last night, I realized that I bit off a lot more than I could chew. So I'm going to try to get everything in that was on the program with respect to your time. But we set forth with a very long agenda to try to get through today. So I'm going to do my best to do it. As the flyer stated, we're going to talk about when you're calling 911, when to call 911, what to say, what to expect. We're going to talk about law enforcement training because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what officers are trained to do and not to do. We're going to talk a little bit about cops and the people that are cops and why we act the way we do sometimes. And then lastly, we're going to talk about CIT and what it looks like across the state, what we want it to look like, and how it can affect you. So let's start with calling 911. I know that regardless of your experience, that's always it can be a scary situation. You're not really sure what it's going to look like, who's going to show up or whatnot. So I want to give you kind of a little bit of understanding of what happens on the other end of 911. But before we talk about that, let's talk about options instead of calling 911. Because the reality of it is when you call 911, you invite law enforcement into your house. You're getting a police officer. There are very few places anywhere in the state where you're going to ever get a social worker right off the bat when you call 911. There are programs coming up that might provide that. But what I will tell you is that it's very hard on a 911 call to completely disregard safety concerns. And because of that, law enforcement typically is still who you're going to get. And at most places, even if you call for a fire department, very few fire departments will respond to mental health emergencies without law enforcement. So do we really want the cops is the question. And I will tell you that even as a cop, the majority of the time that answer is no. That is not who's going to get your loved one the best help. It's not that we suck. It's not that we're going to do anything awful. It's that you are calling to get somebody help, mental health help. And law enforcement is absolutely not the first people that should be giving that to you. I will tell you, you heard my educational background, but I am not always super comfortable going into strangers' houses and providing crisis work. That is, most of my training is law enforcement, even though my education is in mental health. My hands-on day-to-day job has always been law enforcement, which is very different. So make sure you know your local resources. I put a few up here. I do not know all of Yavapai, and I don't know if there's other counties or Northern Arizona present on this presentation, but I put a few resources up there. What I will tell you is that the crisis line is always a good place to start because they can direct you. So if you're not familiar where to go to put somebody in a car and take them, although all of our counties have a 24/7 resource, you can call the crisis line and ask first. The good news is starting, they say July, I'll believe it when I see it, but in July, we're supposed to be getting a 3-digit number for mental health crisis. I mean, I don't tell you the number because I don't want people misunderstanding that it's active yet. But we are across the state developing a statewide 3-digit number that will be available for anybody to call that will direct you to your local resources. So that is really exciting. hopefully that will kind of decrease people calling 911 when they just don't know what else to do. But it's probably going to take about 10 years for people to consistently get used to calling a different number. So it's not something we think is going to change anything overnight. When I talk to families, one of the biggest things that I find is that they have no idea what to do when the crisis happens. They have not planned ahead. And I will tell you, I even teach this to law enforcement officers when I teach them about resiliency and self-care. You have to acknowledge the fact that there might be an emergency at some point. If you were to fall off a ladder and break your leg, you probably know which hospital you want to go to. But for whatever reason, we're really hesitant to have those hard conversations about what to do if my mental health crisis turns into an emergency. So I encourage you, if it's you, to sit down and figure out what that looks like. Who can I call? Who is the person that maybe can step in when my family is struggling? Any kind of alternatives to making that 911 call. And quite frankly, we need to decide what's an emergency. You know, what warrants a police response versus when can I call the crisis line? I mean, the good rule of thumb is if there's not an immediate extreme physical danger, then generally speaking, 911 is not what you should be calling. You should be diverting over to a crisis line. Obviously, if it is an immediate life or death situation, 911 is always going to be who you call. That is why we set up training. That is why we are prepared to handle it. But in order for your loved one to get the help they need, figure out what we need to do before we get to the point of calling 911. Some of the suggestions I always have is that, you know, I personally have friends that talk me down, that are better at speaking with me. Sometimes family members just clash. They just do. So maybe somebody outside of the house who'd be available to come over and kind of try to calm the incident down and get everybody's heads a little bit level. You know, anybody who can have that. You know, where do you want to go? Is there a particular facility that you'd pick over others? I have mine. You know, I will tell you, I know what facility I prefer to go to if I ever become to the point where I need to be in a hospital. You know, I know what that is, and my partner knows what that is. So make sure to have those conversations, because more times than not, we get called out because people don't know what else to do. And this is the hard conversation. You need to understand what happens when you invite law enforcement into your house. And a 911 call is just that. It is an invitation, a legal invitation for law enforcement to come to your house to take over the situation, to fix it. A lot of times people call with the expectation of the officer will come and do what they want. And I'm going to tell you that that's not always the case. And something that you really have to keep in mind when you're making that call is that there are some actions that the state law requires officers to make arrest in, specifically when it comes to any kind of domestic incident. Now, what I'll tell you is that you should never care about that if it's your safety involved. You shouldn't. We're going to have to work through that because we don't want people getting hurt. But I have seen minor incidents that also are connected to domestic violence turn into arrest and have family members very upset that they called for mental health help and their individual ended up in jail. And understand that when I was started as a cop, and probably for the first 10 years of my career, I maybe could have a little more discretion about what that looked like, even if it, you know, stretched policies and law a little bit. But the majority of officers nowadays are wearing body cameras. So those body cameras hold us super accountable to following all of the policies and procedures now. So back when we used to kind of look past minor criminal law violations, we can't do that anymore because we jeopardize our job because everything's on camera. It's kind of the evil part about camera. It takes a little bit of our discretion out of the picture. So just understand what could happen when you call and make sure that there's other steps that you are taking before you get to that point. So what to expect when you call. And I will tell you that the number one thing that people tell me that upsets them when they're on the phone with 911 is that darn 911 operator not listening to them and asking them all these stupid questions. I hear that all the time from family members. So 911 dispatchers are regulated federally. There are certain things that they have to say and triage lists that they have to do. They are absolutely going to go by that script. They have to. Their phone calls are recorded. They are audited. They're going to go by a script when talking to you. What I always tell people is you just have to get through the script. A lot of times people interrupt. They become irritated by the questions, and they either stop answering them or they keep interrupting. And all of that does is delay the process. Like, let the communications person get through their script. If you are in a really bad situation and you cannot stay on the phone, if you don't get anything out, you need to get out your address. Because if you call 911 and we know where you are, even if you hang up, we're going to get to your house. That is the number one thing that we need to know. But if you can, be patient. Answer the questions that they're asking. They're going to ask you who you are, what your name is, what your address is. They're going to ask things like, are there weapons involved, that kind of stuff. So get through that process. After you are there, the first thing you need to say to them is that you are calling about a mental health crisis. A lot of times what we hear is people call and they say, you know, my son, my daughter, they're out of control, they're breaking stuff in the house. And I will tell you, in law enforcement, that triggers a different response versus we're having a mental health crisis. So what's going on? Well, because of my mental health crisis, my son, my daughter is out of control. Those are two different things in law enforcement. If you start off with any kind of criminal behavior, that is how the call is coded. That is how the officers are responding. That is the first thing they hear, is that we have to manage this criminal behavior first. So I suggest that you just start off by saying that specifically from the start, that that's a mental health crisis. So Lucy asked, doesn't 911, don't they know automatically where the call was coming from? With the invention of cell phones, that's not the case anymore, Lucy. We can pinpoint locations on cell phones, but if it's in landlines, we can, but most people don't have a landline. So if you have a landline, yes, they know where the call is coming from. If it's a cell phone, which 90% of the calls are nowadays, we're lucky if we can kind of triangulate a location. So especially if you're not, you know, if you're in a place where that's, you know, you're in a rural area and it could be a large area that's triangulating, we're not going to necessarily know where you are. So that is why the location's always the most important, because people just don't have landlines anymore. So secondly, once you've gotten to the point to where you're telling them what's going on, please be honest and do not exaggerate. A lot of times we see people that are frustrated with the length of time it takes officers to get to the house. And I understand that, because sometimes it can be daunting to sit with your loved one during this crisis and wait for the officers. And in some of your areas, that's quite a wait. If you've only got a few officers or deputies and you're in a county, that could be a wait. But please, please, please don't exaggerate. Don't. Sometimes I'll see people say, well, are there any weapons involved? Well, he has a pocket knife in his pocket. You know, is that really a weapon, or is that what he carries in his pocket all the time? You know, or I have personally responded on calls where the individual is, quote, out of control, assaulting people in the house, to literally find them sleeping in their bed. I have found them that way. And that is because people get frustrated with response times. But we do not want to imply something is occurring that is not occurring just to speed up the process. I want you to be honest about what's going on. If you can, ask specifically for a crisis intervention team officer or a CIT officer. If you don't know what that is, we'll talk about that later in the presentation. But what I will tell you is they exist in Yavapai County. The sheriff's department up there came down here years ago now, 3, 4, 5 years ago. David Rhodes personally came down and learned about CIT and took our lesson plans and whatnot and went and made them work up in Yavapai County. So you do have CIT officers scattered throughout Yavapai County, and in the cities and in the rural areas. We are growing more of that. In my new job now, that is part of my job, is growing CIT across the state. So hopefully there'll be more of that across the state. But what I will tell you is that even if they don't know what you're talking about, or they don't have any, that again is that alert to say this is a mental health crisis, to focus on the mental health part. So when officers hear that, they say they know that the person that they're responding to might be in some kind of mental health crisis. So it's just kind of a good way to ask for that. And lastly, follow instructions when they're given by the dispatcher or the officer. Sometimes officers will personally call you on the phone as they're arriving to kind of give you instructions. The hardest part about this is sometimes you are going to be asked to leave the home. And that is hard, especially if your person is a risk to themselves. I know this, I've seen the struggle with family members, but I will tell you that it changes our response and it increases our, I don't want to say we get more intense, but if somebody is actually, with another person who might be at risk, that's going to change the response. So if we can isolate people, we're going to slow everything down. We're going to take our time. We're going to make it safer. So if you are instructed to leave your house and wait outside for the officers, please do that. As hard as it's going to be. And I know it is, because you just really don't want to leave somebody alone by themselves. But at this point, with police responding, that is the safest answer to that. So what happens when we get there? I've seen this many times. Part of my bio is that I was a patrol officer. I was a patrol officer for more than half of my career. So that means I was the boots on the ground person responding. The first thing that we do on any scene, any type of scene, no matter what, we're trained from day one in the academy, is to make it safe. We're going to focus on that first and foremost. We're going to talk a little bit about cop culture and why we do the things we do and why we think how we think. But I will tell you that for all of us involved, officers and the people, the first 5 minutes are the danger zone. That's when we get killed. That's when we get shot. That's when other people get shot. They did a huge study in Phoenix about officer-involved shootings. I'm sure you guys saw those in the paper or whatnot. And the large majority, I think upwards of like 90% of officer shootings happened in the first 5 minutes. And a lot of times that happens because one, emotions are super high, and then two, people just aren't capable or are refusing to listen and follow instructions, and things just go bad. So when the officers get there, listen and follow instructions. You might not agree. You might absolutely not agree. You might not like what they say. You might be even uncomfortable with what they say, but we've got to get to the point where everybody is safe and kind of controlled. And then you'll have the opportunity to talk. I will tell you that officers, when they first get there, they lose their personality. They're super focused on what they have to do. So they might not let you talk. They might not listen to your story until everything is under control. That is not in their head. That is not the time for you to talk to them. Sometimes they will. I mean, if you're waiting outside for the officer and your loved one is in the house, then they might be able to do that. But if we're talking any kind of chaotic scene, they're going to do everything they can to kind of get it under control before they start having conversations. One thing that I know upsets people at times is that we use handcuffs as a way to make people safe. Handcuffs are not fun. I will tell you, in the academy, we probably put handcuffs on each other 2,000 times. I hate handcuffs. They're uncomfortable. They're not fun. Nothing about having your arms restrained is fun, but that is how we typically control people when they are in a crisis to make them safe. I will tell you that when somebody is up and swinging and pacing and running and all of that, they're not safe. So having them restrained even temporarily, is going to make everybody safer. And what I always tell people is they come off as easy as they go on. So it's not like if they're in handcuffs that they can't come out of them. Sometimes it is just that option to make it safer. And I see the next question, and we'll talk about it right here. Less lethal options. And by less lethal options, we're talking about beanbag guns. So they look like shotguns, but they shoot a less lethal, literally a bag of bean or pellets to people. And then, you know what, everybody knows what a taser is. There's also there's pepper spray, there's other options for less lethal. We use those to gain control over situations faster. Most of the time, if you go hands-on with somebody and it is an all-out brawl, it takes forever to get somebody under control. People get hurt. People that are under the influence of drugs are, they could possibly get something called excited delirium, which can turn into a fatal thing if your temperature goes up, all of that. So typically speaking, if we need to gain control of somebody who is actively presenting assaultive, that's what we would call it, active aggression. We are going to try to use those less lethal options to gain control faster. I will tell you that tasers are not super successful. They have less than 50% success rates. So as great as they are, and I personally have used them in some pretty nasty crisis situations, they don't always work. So officers they're really going to be hesitant to use those if they're close to somebody and they don't have the time for failure. So tasers are not as great as people think. But remember that sometimes we have those shotguns that shoot things besides shotgun shells. And we'll use those a lot because they kind of stun people into stopping doing whatever they're doing. But when we do those, it's to get the situation under control faster. And that is why we would use it. What I hear people say is, well, you didn't have to do that. My son, my daughter, they've never hurt me. They're not going to hurt you. And a lot of people feel like officers overreact. And what I implore you to remember is that you've spent your entire life or their entire life with this person, and you might know that they won't hurt you, but that might be the officer's very first time of ever meeting them. So as much as you might know that, we are judging it based on their behavior at that moment. And if it looks aggressive and it looks assaultive, that is when we're going to step it up. But our entire goal for this process is to stabilize that scene so we can figure out what to do from then forward. So even if you feel like the officer is overreacting or doing something that you don't like, stay calm. The calmer you are, the calmer they are. I will tell you that we are just like everybody else. If you are screaming and yelling, we start screaming and yelling, and then you start screaming and yelling, and it just continues a process. But if you are the calm person there, which I know is a lot to ask of the situation that is a crisis, but if you stay calm, the officer's going to dial it back a lot quicker. So do your best to stay as calm as possible. Let them finish whatever they're doing, and then you can talk to them. Or you can ask for a sergeant, or you can make a complaint. You can do all these things after the fact, but it's just not a good idea to try to do it when they're trying to stabilize the scene. All right, so after we get it calm, after we get somebody detained, after whatever that looks like, what can we do? And this is why you need to know, why am I calling the officers? What do I want the police to do? We are kind of limited on what we can do. We have a statute that's written into the Arizona Revised Statute, which is the big book of laws and such, that tells us what we can do in a mental health crisis. But keep in mind that the big thing that governs what we do is the Constitution. The Constitution tells us when we can touch people. The Constitution tells us when we can take people against their will. The Constitution tells us when we can go into people's houses. So even though we have a state statute, the overall governing document for law enforcement is the U.S. Constitution. I will tell you that even if the officer follows state law, they can be federally sued for violating somebody's constitutional rights, even if they follow their local law, even if they follow their policy, because the Constitution ultimately is what tells us what we can do. So we have a few options when we get there. There are times we're going to do nothing. And this is not always what you want. Obviously, if you're calling us, sometimes you want us to do something. Sometimes you just want us to get there so everything calms down. I get that. You know, we do that quite frequently, is just to make the situation a little bit calmer. But there are some times that you're going to want us to do something that we cannot do anything to help the situation because of our restrictions. What I will tell you is that when I started, officers would do everything possible on a welfare check to make face-to-face contact with people. If they were suicidal or whatnot, we would get into people's houses and do anything we could. And unfortunately, what we have found over the years is that causes more problems than it helps. You really, the last thing as a armed officer should be doing is forcing entry into somebody's house to check on them. And that is going to make you upset sometimes. I will tell you that, because if your family member is inside and they're suicidal and we're refusing to go into the house, that might be upsetting to you. But we, back to that Constitution, over the years of my career, the courts have essentially said that if you go into somebody's house and something bad happens, it's your fault, regardless of the situation. So more officers have been sued. There's an officer in Alabama right now that's serving a 25-year sentence in prison because something went bad on a call. So because the courts are doing that, officers are going to step back a little bit more and use other resources to try to resolve the situation without going into the house. So you need to know that when you call us, that we're not just going to bust in people's doors. Some agencies will. I will tell you that there are some rural agencies that still do that. But across the state, the consensus now is to do everything outside and bring out some people outside of their house, or send other resources, or look for other options versus going into somebody's house. And then even when we talk to the person, you need to understand they're going to have to display very specific things for us to be able to force them. You know, danger to self or others is the standard for us forcing somebody into our car, into handcuffs, and to get care. And it has to be based on a mental illness. And I tell you that because we get calls from family members all the time where their individual suffers from substance abuse, substance use disorder, and we can't do anything because the statute specifically prohibits that. If the only thing that is going on is that they suffer from substance use disorder, whether it be alcohol, opioids, you name it, if that is all that is going on with them, then we cannot force them to go anywhere. It has to be based on a mental health disorder. So we could take people voluntarily. We can give them rides. Every agency kind of has their own policies about what that looks like. In your areas, I don't know exactly what that looks like, because those are some long drives. Like when I take somebody voluntarily in my part of the county, in Maricopa County, I can drop people off at 3 different locations in less than 30 minutes. So I have that privilege. Up there in Yavapai County, it might be a little different. You know, if you're in Prescott Valley, you know, that's not going to be a big deal. If you're in the more rural areas, you're going to have to see whether or not they can do that for you. And then if they don't do it voluntarily, if the person doesn't want help, we can take somebody for what's called a forced committal. And that goes back to facts that we can articulate as danger to self or others because of a mental health disorder. So if we can establish that, we can do paperwork essentially saying that they have to get help whether they want to get help or not. So we can do that. What I will tell you in the rural areas and some of the other areas, that your crisis teams are going to be the ones to do this. So law enforcement will come to the house. They will make the determination. They will take control of the person, and then they're going to call a crisis team to meet them someplace to finish the paperwork. So that kind of varies county to county on what that looks like. And again, if you don't know, or if you have questions, I encourage you to call the crisis line in your area, and they can walk you through it specifically in your area. What I will tell you about these forced committals is that sometimes people fight. I mean, they don't want to go. That's why we're making them. And sometimes we use handcuffs, and all the time they go in the back of the police car. So those are things that you need to be prepared. And what I will tell you is, if this is such a crisis that they're danger to themselves or other people, that you just have to accept the fact that that's what it looks like, because that is them in handcuffs in the back of a police car is ultimately better than them hurting themselves or somebody else. So that is the policies and procedures of how we transport people. And it is because bad things have happened when we transport people without handcuffs, to them and to us. You know, we have had many circumstances where people manage to still hurt themselves in the back of our cars. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure that they're safe. I will also tell you that many agencies are starting to use something called a wrap. And it literally looks like a human burrito if you've never seen it. And it might look a little disturbing to you, but I will tell you the person is safe. They are well controlled. They're actually probably more comfortable than in handcuffs. And we can transport them safely that way a lot better, because when you've got somebody in handcuffs, you know, they still can kick and flail and do all of that, spit, bite, all of that. When we use this wrap, which has been used across the country for quite a while now, they are very much restrained. And they can't hurt themselves or anybody else. So you might see that in your areas. Just be prepared for that. It looks like when they bring it out, it looks like a flat or a flat mat that has things attached to it, and they essentially roll them up in it and secure them in it. What I will also tell you is it looks a little aggressive when they do it, because you're talking at a minimum probably 2 to 3 officers on top of your family member getting them into this. So I want you to be prepared emotionally for what that might look like. But ultimately, it gets them in the safest place possible. And you might not want to see that, so you might want to step away, and we understand that. A lot of times when I go on calls, I would let the family member know that was going to happen, and give them the option to not be there to see it if they wanted to, but just be aware of it. Do officers ever respond with a K9 unit? So K9 units are very specifically tasked animals. K9 units are for suspect apprehension, drug search and seizure, bomb sniffing, that kind of stuff. So if we're not investigating a crime, typically K9s are not going to respond, because we're not going to use the level of force that a K9 brings on a mental health call. Now, if your family member is armed, then they might, because that steps it up a little bit on what kind of force we might have to use to resolve the situation. But because dogs are trained to bite and sniff, we're not going to use them too often on mental health calls if there's not that criminal aspect. And Peggy, I agree, straitjacket comes to mind. But again, we have decreased injuries significantly by using the wrap. And it doesn't look good. Personally, if I was in a crisis and you wrap me up like a burrito, I would not love it. But you know, ultimately it keeps the person the most safe as possible. And it's only temporary. We're going to get them into where they need to get help. So we kind of have to look at the big picture in that for when we use them. So that is all I have for calling 911. Does anybody have any other questions before we go into law enforcement training? Do they ever use support canines? There are some agencies that have canines that respond after the fact, but because of the fluid nature of most crisis calls, for the safety of the canine support animals, they're not going to come right away. Scottsdale has canine crisis dogs. They have some in the schools, which are actually there on crisis. But for the most part, because crisis calls are unpredictable, you're not going to see a support dog there right away until it gets resolved. And honestly, I don't know of any of your agencies up there that have the canine support. But I think this is Ibel. Was the wellness called on the landlord or the tenant? Sorry, I give her both. I mean, it kind of sounds like there was some mediation going on there. What I will tell you is that what I suggest in those cases is to call Adult Protective Services. If you've got somebody who is being abusive to a vulnerable adult, that Adult Protective Services is probably the way to go with that. Just understand they don't respond like police. It's probably like 5 or 6 across the state. There are very few investigators. But when we're looking at what is a criminal versus what isn't, it has to get to a certain point before we can take action on a vulnerable adult abuse case versus APS, Adult Protective Services, which standards are a little bit lower than ours and less, and they can come in and provide resources to everybody involved. I would also suggest calling crisis teams out there if you are physically present with them and there's an ongoing kind of crisis. You can always call your community crisis teams, again, through the crisis line, to come out and respond there to help with that situation. If it's not really a criminal call and it's more a civil call, meaning, there's landlord-tenant issues, one or both have mental health issues, then I would probably see if I could use a community crisis team for that to try to make sure everybody is getting the resources they need. Yes, Audrey, we're going to get to the training and what everybody is doing. So what does training look like in Arizona? As I told you, across Arizona, there are more than 15,000 law enforcement officers. A lot of them are in Phoenix, obviously, but they are spread across the entire state. We have city officers, county, college, state, federal, and tribal. So we have a lot of different officers. In order to be a state certified officer in Arizona, you go through training through AZ Post, which stands for Arizona Police Officers Standards and Training. So those are the people that dictate the minimum training for law enforcement officers. And what I will tell you is that the minimum training hours is about 585 hours, and those are in the academy training hours. But what I will also tell you is that there are very few places in Arizona that currently only teach that many. You can see in Mesa, we teach 300 more hours than we are required to. They have added about 4 weeks of training to the academy since I went through. And then they train longer in the field than when I went through. So every year we kind of do a little bit more training. And I always hear, well, people have to go to cosmetology school longer than they have to go to school to be an officer. And that's true, but the reality of it is most of the training that we do in law enforcement it takes place in the field. And when you're looking at cosmetology, massage school, that kind of stuff, a lot of their training is hands-on. So that's how they're learning it. But we can't do hands-on training till we get out of the academy. So we teach a lot post-academy. That's where we're learning the big chunk of what's going on. The good thing is that we get continuing training, much like all professions. It's kind of like a CEU if you've been through any kind of social work or license thing. We have to have so many hours of proficiency. And 8 of those hours are hands-on stuff, which means shooting, defensive tactics, that kind of stuff. And then 8 other hours are classroom hours. And typically speaking, we have some kind of mental health refresher or behavioral health refresher most years that's given out by the Arizona Police Officers Standards and Training. So what we've had over the last probably 10 years that I can remember, we've had developmental disability training, we've had training on autism, we've had training on Alzheimer's, dementia, we've had training on psychosis. So we've had a little bit of different everything that we get every year, but that is what establishes the training that officers get overall. So what does it look like for mental illness? The good thing is last year, think it was last year. They came to a bunch of subject matter experts, myself included, and said that we needed to beef up the mental health training in the academy, which I will tell you that in Mesa, we've been doing 4 times the amount required for years now because we know that we need to. So what they did is they made that required for everybody in the state. So prior to that, I will also say that the majority of academies had been doing mental health first aid. So the metropolitan academies have different training than the rural academies usually, because the metropolitan academies have subject matter experts embedded in their agencies like myself. But your rural agencies, what they were doing was mental health first aid. And I don't know if you guys have heard about that, but they were getting 8 hours already. So one of the common misconceptions is that if they don't have CIT training, they don't have training, and that is not true. All officers have some training in mental health awareness, basic understanding of the legal requirements for it, that kind of stuff. We come out of the academy with that training. Do I wish it was longer? Of course I do. But what I will tell you as somebody who's went through a police academy is your brain can only absorb so much during the academy. And if you can't relate it to real life, it's really hard for you to understand. So we don't want to throw a whole lot of stuff at them in the academy about mental illness because they don't know what it's going to look like. We want to wait till they actually understand what they're responding to. Because what I will tell you is that I never in my life thought that the biggest job I would do in law enforcement would be mental health crisis. And that is the reality of law enforcement right now, that is one of the biggest things we do, but you can't describe it until you see it. So that's why we do a lot of our mental health training after they get out of the academy, so they can actually understand what's going on. And then we also hear, why don't we give CIT to everybody? CIT 40 hours, the whole thing for everybody. We'll talk about this during the CIT section, but what I will tell you is that when you leave the academy, the biggest thing you're trying to accomplish is not getting killed. And that sounds extreme, but that is the reality of law enforcement in this day and age. Is when we have our kids, and I say kids because that's what they feel like to me, when they're leaving the academy, the biggest thing we're teaching them is that officer safety. And until you really are a safe officer and you know how to manage scenes, you cannot absorb this extra training that CIT is. And it's also not feasible to be really realistic about it. CIT is designed in a certain way. There are 28 blocks during a CIT course. And out of those 28 blocks, 25 of them are taught by mental health professionals. So they train us for free. They do it on their time. Their companies send them. In Maricopa County alone, we put on one CIT school a month, one a month. So one a year, 12 throughout the year. And so that's not counting the ones put up in Yavapai County or Gila County or Coconino County. So there's just no way to bring all these people in to every police academy all the time to do this training. And quite frankly, it's a waste because, as I said, the officers just don't understand what to use it for at that point. And we'll talk a little bit more about why CIT is not for everyone when we talk about CIT, but that is one reason we don't teach it in the academy. So what we're looking at right now in the state of Arizona is that we do have some people that use mental health first aid on top of the 8-hour requirement. So they're getting both because they have to use the Arizona Post certified lesson plan now that basically everybody in the entire state learns the same thing. We wanted consistency about what we were teaching in the academy. So everybody gets that. But what I have found is some of your other academies, your rural academies specifically, are still using mental health first aid. So that is doubling what they're getting in the academy, which is a great thing. All of our academies also require scenarios. And I will tell you as an officer, that's where we learn the best, is those hands-on scenarios. So we actually create scenarios for people that are suicidal, people that on wellness checks, all those things that we typically see. We create those hands-on scenarios for our recruits in the academy to go through. And then many of our academies now, unfortunately for the last 2 years, we haven't done this, but in Mesa specifically, we brought NAMI in to teach our academy. And I will tell you that when they do the interim voice presentation, that always gets rave reviews, way better than my class does. So when I can bring actual individuals in, they're living with mental illness, in to meet the recruits and to tell stories and to talk to them about their experiences with law enforcement, that's really changing their view on responding to these calls. So hopefully, COVID is going to stay away enough that we can bring these back, because those really made a difference in our academies. And if I don't know if they do that in the Yavapai, if the Sheriff's Department Academy, but if not, I would suggest you guys try to get in there. I mean, it's only 90 minutes. Try to get into your academies up there to give that presentation, because I can talk about mental illness till I'm blue in the face, but when they meet people, that's what makes a difference. So if you can get those into your academies, I really suggest you do that. All right, any questions about training that is not CIT? We're gonna talk specifically about training and CIT training after we talk about COPS. One thing I do want to say before we move on to the COP culture is that sometimes when you see things that don't go as they should, or an officer that doesn't act like they should, it doesn't have to do anything with training usually. Some people just are not cut out to do it. That is the reality of it. I have gone into ERs where people are horrible individuals when you're trying to get help. I can't train humanity. You cannot train somebody to be that. So a lot of times when it doesn't go like it's supposed to, a lot of it comes down to just a person acting like a person. That's why I want you to know that everybody has the training. So it's not necessarily a lack of training when things don't go right. Sometimes it's just a lack of humanity, unfortunately. So if we could train that, or if we could hire people that were always empathetic, then we'd score. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. All right, so we're going to talk about officers specifically. And I just want to give a disclaimer to this video. The video was made by a police agency, and some of it is acting, some of it is not. There are some disturbing images. There are some disturbing audio attached to this. So if you do not want to see or listen, turn off your audio, all of that. But I show this video because it is an awesome description of kind of what it's like to be an officer and the things that we go through in our day-to-day lives, from, leaving our families to managing basic stuff to, something going really, really wrong. So this video is great. The song is amazing, although that's, I would tell you that I show this video all the time, and every time I show it, the song gives me chills, but it's a very appropriate video to understand what it's like to be a cop and why we're kind of weird.
Lifted scenes while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walked alone, streets of cobblestone, over streetwear. I turned my collar to the cold and damp. When my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People
So why do we act the way we do? It doesn't matter how many times I see that video. It's a struggle for me. You need to understand that when we get into law enforcement, the number one answer when they ask you why you want to be an officer is you want to help people. You want to give back to the community. It kind of puts us in a weird place. I mean, you think, hey, that's a great way to think, but it also puts us in a place where we're protecting of you. And when you think about the flock, sometimes the flock does things that the sheepdog wish they didn't do, and they have to put themselves between them and the wolf, and it kind of creates an environment where we're different than you. I mean, and that's from the beginning, that's kind of how we feel. I will tell you that we do not have great attention because we are multitasking. Personally, in my retirement, one of my biggest struggles is not multitasking, is trying to focus on one thing at a time. I've never done that. Almost 24 years I've spent always multitasking. You see, when we're in a car, we've got several radios going, we've got a computer that we're looking at, we're watching all the way around us all the time. Especially probably in the last 10 years, because ambushes are real, those things happen, so your brain's going constantly all the time, and we kind of seek that after a while. We drive fast. Some of the worst drivers, and I know you guys have seen it, some of the worst drivers are officers. We drive fast. We can disregard state laws. There's actually a law that says we don't have to follow the law. So that leads to reckless behavior sometimes. I will tell you that if somebody runs from us, we're going to chase them. And then afterwards you ask them, well, why did you chase them? And the only answer is, well, they ran. Like, you have no idea why you're chasing them. It's kind of like when you throw a ball to a dog, it's an automatic reflex. There are some people that work OT shifts all the time because they constantly need that adrenaline high. And then when you're, especially early on in your career, when you're off, you tell stories. Like when you're a new officer, it's the big thing to go and talk about what you've done for the day and the cool things and the arrests that you've made and everything else. So it kind of just becomes part of you and your life. And unfortunately, some of the things that happen is you get jaded. You get jaded about society. For whatever reason, people lie to us about everything, even things they don't need to lie about. We always joke that even our mother would lie to us if we pulled her over for speeding, because that's just what we feel like. And one of the obvious things is the secondary trauma. I mean, we got plenty of first person trauma, but we get a lot of secondary trauma. I will tell you that personally, my biggest traumatic incidents for me are death notifications. And the death itself, I don't struggle with. Seeing other people find out that somebody has died is hard for me. It's really, really hard for me. And that tends to have an impact on you. I've had to leave work before or after them because they have such an impact on me. And remember that, like, people don't invite us to birthday parties. They don't call us to come over just to hang out with them. The only time we go to anybody's house, something bad is happening. And quite frankly, even when we pull somebody over, that is probably one of the worst things that could happen to them that day. So we see bad all the time. And unfortunately, we do it alone for the most part. Very few places do you have groups of officers that go everywhere together. We always joke that, fire departments, 4 people all the time. They eat, they sleep, they do everything together. And, as an officer, it's just you and your car after the fact, and you have to manage that on your own. There's obviously the danger and the safety impact to it. There is an app on my phone that tells me every time an officer is killed in this country. I mean, what profession has that, an app for officers being down? And I will also tell you that in my 23-year career, I attended 24 funerals for people that have died in my profession in just this state alone. So more than one a year for the most part. And I was on the death of Officer Shoe Handler in Gilbert. So I took probably a 4-year break because after that funeral, I couldn't go to him for a while. So that is part of our job is that safety. And it comes from a lot of places. It's not all, people shooting us, but, just this week, 2 troopers were run over back east, just standing on the side of the road. So there is that danger is very real to us. It is not something that's just in our head, although paranoia is sometimes just in our head. Very hyper vigilant about everything we do. Even when I'm not at work, I am the same. I cannot sit with my back to the door. To this day, I still don't do that. I always face the door. But I'm finding myself a little less hyper vigilant, in normal situations, thank God. And I think Kathy mentioned that I look younger. Like I feel like I'm getting younger. Some of that stuff is going away, thank goodness. But that is the nature of the job, and you have to be that way to survive. It's not like it's really a choice. You need to be that way or you're going to become a statistic sometimes. Because of that, you develop this warrior mindset that you have to control the situation. And if you don't, you failed. And that starts way back in the academy for us. I remember on a scenario I failed in the academy. I did everything right on the scenario. It was a domestic violence scenario. But the evaluator basically said I didn't control the parties well enough, and I failed that scenario. And that, I remembered that my entire career because that is how you see it. If we go on your call and people are screaming and yelling and fighting and we can't get it under control, to us, that is a failure. So we always try to have that control. And I could tell you, that's probably why we end up divorced half the time too, is because we're so controlling, because we can't really, do something different outside of work that we do at work. And, we are in that profession where when I say goodbye to somebody, I say, have a safe shift. I say, be safe, be careful. That is how we have our communication with each other. So with all that having said, any time that we are trying to divert out of the system, that is a win for us. That is going against the culture that we have created. Our culture has been basically arresting people for years. That is how we solve a lot of problems. But now we're teaching people to divert. But unfortunately, we struggle with that because sometimes it takes too long, especially in your areas. If officers have to wait 45 minutes, 2 hours for a crisis team to show up, they're probably going to find a faster solution to that problem. And it's maybe not even the best solution, but we struggle with waiting. And then we feel like we're constantly dumped on by the behavioral health system. When we have to respond, I will tell you that we get a significant amount of calls from clinics, from the crisis line, from professionals. So when we get called by experts, that's extremely frustrating. And then we turn around and something bad happens and people ask us why we don't have enough training. And we're like, well, the people that have 8 years of degrees called us to manage the situation. So it's that expectation of what do we do when the experts can't even manage their situations. So we feel pretty dumped on sometimes. I will say the new number coming up hopefully is going to change that a little bit. I will say that the systems being developed in places like Yavapai County to create better resources and places for people to get help hopefully are going to change that. We are moving in the right direction to take law enforcement kind of out of this system. And we also feel just like you do that we're stuck in a cycle. I can't tell you how many people that I took to local facilities 10, 15 times. I remember this one guy that it was a monthly thing to take him in because he was not following his court ordered treatment. And we have this all the time with individuals that are in this cycle. When we have to balance, somebody's rights, to have their mental health illness as they want or take their medications if they don't want to, we always are balancing their rights with that and kind of the cycle that they get into. So we're just like you, we see that cycle too. So that when you have your son, your daughter, your loved one that is in and out of facilities, we feel that, we get that with you guys. And what I always try to tell people is anytime we don't arrest, that is a positive. We don't actually make a lot of arrests. That is a very common misconception that we arrest a lot of people. It's a very low percentage of people that we come in contact with that we arrest. But if we divert to anything, that is a positive for us. Clinics, whether it be shelters, anything like that, I will tell you that sometimes officers don't really know the difference. They just know it's not jail. So sometimes you might think, well, that's the last place they need to go. But if that place is not jail, that is still a success. And we're kind of hoping that the system takes over at that point. So that is our mindset when it comes to these calls. I will say that my generation struggled with mental health calls. We fought it for years and years and years. We would say that it's not our problem. This is not our concern. Why are we doing this? But over the last probably 5 to 7 years, the new generation of officers actually think it's their responsibility. So we're moving in that direction. Hopefully we take us out of the role a little bit just to get people the better help. But the good news is that your millennials and your Z generation think differently. And they're kind of coming into law enforcement expecting to have to understand mental health crisis. So that in itself is going to probably be a positive in the police culture and the changes that are happening. So before we finish off with CIT, anybody have any questions that they've always wanted to ask about why that asshole cop acted the way they do? I'm happy to answer it.
Oh, this is Kathy.
Yes.
I've seen some asshole cops, but and matter of fact, I was just recently in a situation such as that where a cop took over, and I don't like to be taken over. But once I stepped back and saw and had listened to you and to other people, you get a better perspective. And I think that's what's so valuable of this training is you're sharing that perspective, the human perspective. And if we can advance some of this in our community, I think we'd be really, really wonderful to see that happen.
I agree. And I think we've got to get rid of that divide of us versus them, especially in the behavioral health community, because out of all the communities, we probably have more connection to you guys than anything. One, we have a lot of interaction, so we really need to work together. But if you just think about, I am not shy about my own diagnosis. I've shared it for years. I have lived with PTSD. I was diagnosed with it back in 2002. I currently take medication. So I've always shared that. And I think a lot of officers, just by the nature of the job, should have kind of a better understanding of what that feels like, because, the job is in itself a diagnosis. I don't know if you know, but one of the criteria of PTSD is my job is written in that criteria. So,
but Amanda, you and Maricopa County came and rubbed shoulders with us. We went out for dinner, we did things and joined groups and whatever. We don't have that up here. We need role models up here for our people to just see as true human beings and to mix with us. Yeah. And we don't have that.
That's interesting, because I know Yavapai County sheriffs worked really hard. I work side by side with several deputies up there. So
they're not like you. They don't arrive in a jalopy, with the fender falling off and the license plate sideways.
Right. Well, I drove the free car, whatever it was. All right. The CIT.
I just wanted to add real quick to this. Sorry, this is Vance Phillips here. But it's one of the things, because I work with young people, just mentoring. I mean, I mentor everybody. It just seems to be in that nature. And we have this conversation. And I tell them all the time, it's exactly what you're saying, is that people forget that police officers are human beings. And I always remind them, I say they deal with the worst of the population 90% of the time and the best 10% of the time. So and I say all the time, I say it's your responsibility to engage with people. Like when I see police officer QT, I say, how you doing? What's going on? I mean, I'm a large guy. I'm like 6'3", about 275. So sometimes they're kind of taken aback. But then when I see them more often, I just talk to them and just take 2 minutes for them to get to know them and understand they're in a tough position, because everyone likes to play Monday morning quarterback. But I said, well, when you're in a situation when things are happening and you don't know what's going on and you're having to make a decision, it's a whole different ball game. And so by that, enabling young people to understand better what it's like to be in there, to put themselves in their shoes, and how they can actually operate to de-escalate the situation by having the information, be willing to share what they've seen and what they know with the officer, and to build it from that standpoint, to give them the sense of taking responsibility for what's happening in their areas as well.
Yeah, I appreciate what you say, Vance, because I think where we struggle is that you talk about police training and everything else, but it's a two-way conversation. And, we don't always have the two-way going, that if we can get to that, I think a lot of the issues will be resolved. And I will tell you that if you ever have groups of kids that you want me to come talk to, I'm happy to do that, or find somebody that's in your area that would be willing to do that, because those conversations matter. And I will also tell you, Kathy, that I literally brought Tracy and Natalie from Scottsdale with me because I was terrified to go to those meetings, terrified, because it's really hard to switch from the cop to the person sometimes. And Vance talks about QT. There were some times that I, after the fact, I got mad at myself because somebody would say something nice to me at QT, and I had literally just come from some horrible situation where my brain was not functioning right. I'm just getting a drink at QT, and then some nice person like Vance says something nice to me, and I'm like grumpy and I can't respond. But it's because my brain hasn't readjusted yet. I'm better at it than I used to be, but when I was early on, I struggled even with those kind of conversations because of the mindset you constantly put yourself in. So I appreciate, what you're saying, Vance. And like I said, if you ever need a person to come talk to your kids, I'm really happy to do that.
Thank you.
Let's just talk a little bit about CIT before we finish, and I'll try to do it quickly so we got a little time at the end to make sure that everybody gets their question and comments put out there. But in case you are not aware, the CIT program, the T stands for team, but understand that that's not a physical team. That is a team concept. That is where we get that. It's a collaborative approach, and it was initially created to improve safety for everybody. And honestly, it was created to divert people away from jail. It came from Memphis 30 plus years ago at this point. But we're trying to divert people out of the system as much as possible. So a lot of the concepts that we want to focus on are things that keep us out of the mental health business altogether as law enforcement. The sooner we are not involved, the better it is for everybody. In order for CIT to work, you have to have all 5 of these things. So it's called the 5-legged stool concept. And I will tell you, there are some places that struggle with this because they don't have a vibrant crisis system, or they don't have the advocacy that you guys have. So one particular county, like Navajo County, has CIT training, but all they have is the training. They don't have the resources to back it up. They don't have anything else like that. So CIT is great, and I can train officers, but it doesn't do me any good to train officers when there's absolutely nothing for them to use up there to divert people out of the system for. So understand that when we're talking about CIT, we have to have all of these concepts, and you have them in Yavapai. So that's why you do actually have a really good CIT program up there. Apparently, we just need to connect you guys more to some real people up there so you can interact with them. But it's a week-long training, 40 hours long. It goes through these different things. We talk about psych disorders. We bring a doctor in usually to talk about those specific disorders. And a lot of what CIT is that resource utilization. So we want to make sure that after we recognize the person has a mental health problem going on, we get it under control, and then we figure out where to go from there. Instead of just leaving them at home, what other options that we can use? And for these, we bring in local providers. So I can't bring my Maricopa County providers up to Yavapai to teach this. The people in Yavapai teach it based on their own providers, and each county is going to have their own providers. So that is very specific to locations. And then we talk about de-escalation and communication techniques. I will tell you, it's not a huge portion of training because we teach de-escalation and whatnot throughout law enforcement. So it's kind of a refresher on de-escalation. And kind of the biggest thing that CIT offers is that last day, which is an entire day of scenarios. And these scenarios partner both a law enforcement expert and a mental health expert together. And I'll tell you, most of the time, even the actors are part of the mental health system. So it's very real. It's super realistic. And that's what makes it practical. And it's also long. Like I will tell you, in law enforcement training, our scenarios are usually like 5 minutes or so because we're not actors. And our scenarios are kind of based on, you say the right thing and the scenario is completed. And when we do these reality-based scenarios, they're long because real life scenarios are long. So we make the officers interact with the actors for a really long time. And half the time there's not even a solution. It's really just that experience of interacting with somebody in a specific type of crisis. But what I need to make sure you know is it's more than training. It is that community program. Without you guys being involved, it's not going to work. I can train, like I said, I can train officers all day long, but if the advocates aren't involved, if the family isn't trained, if behavioral health isn't trained in law enforcement understanding, then there's going to be that struggle. In Maricopa County, we go to the providers, all the clinics, all of the emergency psychiatric centers. We go there and give them a longer version of that cop culture training. So we actually provide training to them. And we have found that we have a lot more understanding and success from them, because a lot of times when officers show up in a mental health clinic to resolve a crisis, I can tell you we've got a really sour look on our face when we're showing up to a mental health clinic to help them resolve a mental health crisis. So we talk through that and why we react to why we do and what we can do and what we can't do, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what we can and we can't do. And honestly, sometimes we go to the clinics and educate them on what they can do, because they have such high turnover sometimes that they're not even sure about, legally speaking, what's going on. So it's a great relationship to have. And I suggest you make sure that's happening up there. I don't know, Audrey might know better than I do, but that, we need to all be talking to each other. We are also doing this in the majority of our communication centers for law enforcement and fire. So in Maricopa County, we're doing straight diversions to the crisis line. I'm pretty sure in Yavapai County, they're doing it because they train their dispatchers as well. I know in Coconino County, they're doing it. So that is probably the biggest advancement that we have had in the last couple of years to divert people away from the criminal justice system, is to just flat out give them resources from the beginning instead of having to resort to that 911 call. Somebody did say that, why not train about the rollout? And I will say that I'm not sure it's going to roll out in July. I'll believe it when it happens. So that's why I'm a little nervous about it. Although I'm pretty sure if you call that number and you can read the chat, you can read the number. I've just been told not to talk about the number specifically. But I'm pretty sure if you call it in Arizona right now, it actually already works. But I'm not positive that's for the entire state. They haven't even picked, just for your reference, they haven't even picked who's going to run that line yet. So that's why I'm a little hesitant to throw it out there, because timelines don't always seem to happen when they're supposed to. But it will be widely broadcast when it is official. And we already talked about this in another section, but why don't we all get CIT training? Why isn't it appropriate for all law enforcement? And not to get too technical on you guys, but there's a lot of research that says CIT is the best thing, that it works, that it changes law enforcement's perception of people in a mental health crisis. But having said that, one of the requirements put forth by CIT International, or two requirements, are that the officer wants to do it. So it's a specialist, just like any other specialty in law enforcement. My specialties in law enforcement were DUI investigations, gang investigations, believe it or not, and forensic interviewing. So those were kind of my specialties. And then I got CIT as well. So each officer kind of picks their specialty. And when you have a specialty, you're good at your specialty because that's what you actually want to do. When you force people to do it, they don't really have the buy-in that people that want to do it have. And then the second part is the experience. We need to make sure that the officers are to a point in their career where they can manage everybody's safety on the scene first, before we jump into this really specialized kind of training. And my personal opinion on this isn't based on what CIT says, is I respect the people that come in and give their personal perspective way too much to fill it up with a room full of cops that don't want to be there. And if you ever want to see, and I could tell you, I've taught my entire department, which is 850 officers, all for a day and a half of mental illness. And about half of those people don't want to be there. And it makes for a very long day sometimes. So I respect people that are going to share their personal experience, and that is spread out throughout CIT, more than to bring them in and put them with a group of people that don't want to listen to their story. They deserve better than that. So that is my personal belief on why not everybody gets it. But hopefully, having said that, you have some comfort in knowing that everybody has training. Everybody has training. We're not sending any officers out there anymore that don't have some kind of mental health training. What I've just given you, if any or all of it is something that you're interested in, if you think your programs could benefit from it, I'm happy to do it. Each one of the discussions, the 4 different sections that we discussed, are presentations all in themselves. They can be longer versions if there's groups of people. If you've got family to family or whatever that I could come talk about calling 911 to, I'm happy to do that. I love to travel. I have to drive my own car now, Kathy. I don't have a car anymore.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much. And I think if you, it sounds like you're open to hearing from people that may want to see if you can come to their organizations or locations. So if you want to put in the chat how they can contact you, that would be helpful. And I just, again, I really want to thank you, Amanda. So many of us don't have that perspective. It isn't our experience, but the humanness to recognize.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to come talk anytime.
And thanks everybody for attending today. It's great.